Hi, Rabbi Schaffner.
Hi, how's it going? Everybody doing all right? Very good. Any questions that people have about anything? Yeah, one.
Hi, Riley. I have a question. We spoke about Hamas last time, but I wanted to ask you what sort of spiritual preparation do you recommend for Pesach?
Mm,
What kind of readings or
mm-hmm,
prayers or spiritual preparation do you think we should be thinking about?
mm. That's the right question to ask, but not a question that we always do ask. Often, people are so busy, getting ready for Passover, cleaning up and cooking and koshering their kitchen, that getting to sort of step back and say, what is the spiritual uh, orientation here, or as we say in Jewish thought, what's the avoda? What is our service? What is our spiritual work here? So that's great that you're doing that. I think sometimes, especially in the Orthodox community, when things are very much about what you do, about getting all the details right, we sometimes it's very easy to overlook the spiritual forest for the trees. And I often think it's one of the gifts that people who either did not grow up observant or people who didn't grow up Jewish can bring to this is that sometimes, from the inside, you can kind of, take things for granted or get caught up in the details and forget sort of the forest, forget the big picture, and so I think that's one of the wonderful things that you all bring to Judaism. So I'm glad that you asked that question. In fact, there's a lot of discussion about what the symbols of Passover represent. For instance, there's a concept in Jewish thought, especially in Chassidut, in Kabbalah, in Musar, which is a branch of Jewish thought about character development, that chametz, leaven, if you think about it, leaven and matzah are really the same thing. Bread and matzah are both the same ingredients, both flour and water. What's the difference between them? That one has risen and one has not. And how does bread rise? Right? It's air basically. In a certain sense, bread is matzah. It's just that it's pumped up with air. So many say that the lesson is that that's a sign of the Yetzer. It's a symbol, it's a metaphor for the Yetzer Hara, for the evil inclination. And when it comes to character development, especially to learn the books of Musar, there's an entire Jewish literature called the literature of Musar. It began in the early 1800s. I mean, it's been around forever, but it really began as a kind of more organized set of books and yeshivot and Jewish schools in the early 1800s. And it was basically based on the idea that Judaism is not just about doing the commandments and not even about just study, it's about character development. And that kind of character development always begins with humility. Humility, anivut, is always the most foundational characteristic upon which one builds a spiritual character. And so that's what matzah is, right? Matzah is exactly what it is. Matzah isn't faking it. In a certain sense, bread is faking it. I'm not saying you shouldn't eat bread. It's very good, and we do eat it, and we eat it on Shabbos, and it's a mitzvah. And in fact, but in a certain sense, bread is more than it appears to be, and it's just air. That's what makes it taste a lot better. But there's a lesson there about character development. And now it's very interesting. On Passover, you can't have any leaven, you can't have any bread. But if you think about it, there really are the Jewish calendar is actually pretty symmetrical. There are two 7-day holidays, each of which begin on the full moon of the first month of the year. There's more than one first month of the year. There's more than one new year, right? The main new year that we think about, Rosh Hashanah, is Tishrei, is actually what's known in the Torah as the seventh month. That's when Rosh Hashanah, the new year, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and the holiday of Sukkot, the festival of Sukkot are. That was 6 months ago. And now we have Passover. Passover is also in the first month. Even though we count the years from Tishrei, from Rosh Hashanah, from the new year, from Passover, the month of Passover. That's where we count. The Torah itself says this month of Passover, when you left Egypt, this month of Nisan should be to you the first of months. And so while one is the Rosh Hashanah, the New Year for the world in Tishrei in like September time, um, 10 days before Yom Kippur, the Rosh Hashanah for the Jewish people is now. It's this month of Nisan, and so Passover. So really, what you have is the festival of Sukkot, which is in the month of Tishrei, which is it's true the seventh month, but it's really the first month because it's the first month of counting the years. And then you have the 7-day holiday of Passover in the middle on the 15th day, the full moon of Nisan, which is this month. They're 6 months apart, but they're both called the New Year. And they're both 7-day holidays with an eighth day added on. And the eighth day added on is called Atzeret. Atzeret means sort of added on. And now on Sukkot, the eighth day is added on right away. So the last day of Sukkot is called Shmini Atzeret, the eighth day that's added on. It's also in modern terms called Simchat Torah, when you dance with the Torahs, but that's actually a later holiday. In the Torah, it's the eighth day, the day that comes after Sukkot, and it's called Atzeret in the Torah, day added on. Shavuot, which comes 50 days after Passover, is also called Atzeret, the day that's added on. And so, in many ways, Shavuot, which is biblically a 1-day holiday, the day when we assume the Torah was given, is actually the last day of Passover. And we count 50 days to connect them. We're going to count the Omer. We're going to count from the second day of Passover until the holiday of Shavuot. Now, the oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Oh, I'm very sorry, Cassandra. May she have may it go as best it can, and may you and she have strength. Um, the So the holiday of Shavuot, uh, not only is it not about matzah, it's actually about leaven. The bread that was brought in the temple, all of the offerings brought in the temple, perhaps except one, were matzah. They were not. Whenever it says that you mix flour with oil, you bring a grain offering in the temple. That was all matzah, unleavened bread. And because the Torah itself says not to bring leaven into the temple. But on Shavuot, the Torah says you bring 2 loaves of bread, the shtei halechem. And so, in a certain way, Passover is this process of moving from matzah to bread, which is strange. Um, Bread is on Shavuot. That's the holiday of bread. That's why we read the book of Ruth, because it's the harvest of the grain in the book of Ruth, and we read that on Shavuot, on the holiday that comes uh, on the holiday of the giving of the Torah, the holiday that comes 50 days after Passover. So the and so you sort of wonder, what is that about? Why is it that the Exodus is a holiday of matzah, of bread that has not risen, and Shavuot, which we assume represents the giving of the Torah 50 days later, is a holiday of leavened bread, of risen bread? And I think that the answer is that it's only once you have the Torah that you can sort of utilize the world. Uh, you know, at the Exodus, the Jewish people don't have the Torah yet. They don't know how to be in the world, how to act in the world, how to utilize the things of the world for something holy. But so in a certain way, there's no room to eat bread yet. There's just the basics of survival. But it's when you have the Torah, so then you can utilize the Torah to sanctify the physical world, and you can in a certain way it allows for indulgence. And I don't mean that that's what it's about, but you think about Shabbat. Shabbat is actually a day of great pleasure. And yet it's a way of sanctifying these things. You make a blessing on food. The Torah itself commands you to bless God after you eat. So, in a certain way, without all that, how do you sanctify the world? And so there's only room for matzah before you have the Torah. There's survival, but what are you going to do beyond that? Whereas once the Torah is given, So now there's room for bread. Perhaps there's even room for, I'm not saying there's room for ego, but the evil inclination, the Talmud says God created the evil inclination, and God created the Torah as a literally as a spice for it. In other words, the Torah can help you to utilize the evil inclination for positive things, right? In fact, there's a story in the Talmud that the rabbis of the Talmud were perplexed. Why is there, if you look through the prophets, the Hebrew prophets, they're always warning the Jewish people, stop worshiping idols. And the Jews can never stop worshiping idols. They're always going back to worshiping idols again, back and forth and back and forth. And by the time the rabbis of the Talmud are around, they don't really feel the desire for idolatry, like we don't really. I mean, there's things that we imagine, are idolatry, and we are drawn toward them. But nobody's like, got a little statue of Baal in their closet that they're bowing to and can't stop themselves. Whereas if you go to the Israel Museum, you can see Baal. And Baal, for 1,000 years, the Jews were trying to not worship Baal and they just couldn't do it. And the prophets are warning them over and over again. And you're like, what is this about? That's craziness. So the Talmud says that the rabbis of the Mishnah slaughtered the desire, the evil inclination for idolatry. Uh, and then the Talmud says, and then they slaughtered the evil inclination for sexual relations, illicit sexual relations, and um, and then they had to put it back because everything came to a halt. The chickens stopped laying eggs. Nothing happened in the world because on some level, creativity, the things that move us to be human beings, are also connected to our evil inclination. In fact, the Talmud says, without an evil inclination, the Midrash says that when God created the world, in the Torah, it says that every day God said it was good, except for one day. But on Friday, God said it was very good, right? After God creates the human beings. The Midrash says, why is it very good? So the Midrash says, good, this refers to the good inclination. Very good, this refers to the evil inclination. The Talmud says, what do you mean? Is the evil inclination good? And Talmud says, yes, without it, nobody would ever get married or build a house or do anything in the world to have a family. So, but if you just leave it as the evil inclination, you're going to do evil. So the answer is the Torah comes to guide you to utilize your desires and your passions and your hopes and your dreams in a positive way. And in that sense, it's all about bread. In fact, there's um, there's a piece of Talmud which says that if a person wants to just sort of fast on the holidays, they're allowed to. Not really, that's not the law. But on Shavuot, they would not be allowed to, because Shavuot, you have to take some pleasure in. So, and the Talmud says why? And the Talmud says because the day the Torah was given. So, so in a certain sense, the spirituality of Passover is the spirituality of, I think, humility, of being open. The Jewish people, they don't know what's coming. They follow God out into the desert. They immediately start complaining because it's very hard to be in the desert. But think of the faith that it took for them, right? On the 10th day of the month, the Torah says they had to take a lamb. The lamb was the god of the Egyptians. It's the zodiac for Passover. It's Aries. And so they took the lamb and they slaughtered it and they roast it. It has to be roasted. Why roast it? When you roast something, it's smelled by everybody. They had to put the blood on the doorpost, and because this was the Egyptian god, and so the Jews are born in rebellion at that moment on the 10th day of the month, and that 10th day of the month is a day that year, when the Jews came out of Egypt, it was Shabbat. And so we celebrate that because the Shabbat before Passover is called Shabbat Hagadol, the Great Shabbat, because that's when they took the lamb. And so the Jewish people had the ability to have this kind of trust in God. And not everybody did. In fact, the Talmud says that only 1 in 5 Jews came out of Egypt because they were so assimilated. The Midrash has this story of the angel saying to God, "Who are you going to take out of Egypt? They're all idol worshippers, the Jews and the Egyptians." And so God takes out the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Or there's other medrashim that the Jews kept their names and their language, but they were subsumed in Egyptian culture and idolatry. And so the ability to be open to something new, even when it is unpredictable, even when it is scary, even when God says, "Listen, I'm going to take you out of Egypt," but we don't know what's coming. You have to trust Moses and God. So I think, all of that is kind of the spiritual work of Passover. Now, it's also about freedom, right? Because Moses doesn't say to God, "Let my people go." He says, in the name of God, "Let my people go that they may serve me." Right? It's about Passover is about freedom, but it's also about servitude. It's about freedom in order to serve God. That's very interesting that you have to be free in order to serve God. That's fascinating, right? You can't be you can't be, and we none of us really are free. Like, we all have the things that we are enslaved to personally, and so the mystics tell us that the word Mitzrayim, which is the Hebrew word for Egypt, also means tsara, narrow, narrow place, and that coming out of Egypt on Passover, everybody's supposed to see themselves as if they actually are leaving Egypt. That's the work of the Passover Seder, to leave Egypt yourself. And the mystics say that everybody has to find the Passover. It's not that Passover is a time of freedom because the Jews came out of Egypt. The Jews come out of Egypt because Passover is a time of freedom. There's something inherent in the fabric of time right now, in the month of Nisan, the spring. That's a time of freedom, and so we all have to figure out, like, what are we enslaved to that holds us back ultimately spiritually, and we have to be free in order to be servants of God. So I think all of those are sort of it's a great question. I think all of those are sort of spiritual elements that we often overlook. And it's worth taking a few minutes during Passover to think about that.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You bet, Nate.
So you actually kind of got into my question towards the end there about the sages saying that we should all imagine if we were in Egypt and came out. So I'm going to ask a different question. I don't remember which brand it is, but I understand there's a brand of bourbon, so where it's by some authorities not considered kosher because the owner is Jewish but isn't observant and doesn't sell his chametz. But I hear there are some other authorities that disagree because I don't think he's directly involved with the production. He just has ownership. I was wondering if you could
Oh,
delve into that.
yeah. I mean, if a Jew, oh, yeah, it is funny because we have a list. We don't like to buy from Jews. No, it's right. So if you look, for instance, on the CRC website, the Chicago Rabbinical Council, they have a well-developed alcohol list. Let me share my screen with you. See, this is good. We're going from the spiritual to the halacha. All are important. Okay. Okay, this is the Chicago Rabbinical Council. There are other whiskey lists, other alcohol lists, but this is a really good one. So you can select the category. So generally, certain alcohols are generally considered kosher without supervision. So, for instance, beer, if it's unflavored, is usually fine. Um, Bourbon, whiskey, scotch, all these things have very specific, unless they have some artificial flavoring, they all have very specific um, ingredients, and they're all generally kosher. The only exceptions are if something has wine in it, so cognac, brandy, any kind of wine, any kind of some liqueurs have wine in them, or something has grape juice in it. So that could be a problem because there's a rabbinic decree, even if all the ingredients are kosher, there's a rabbinic decree against using wine that's made by a non-Jew, or non-boiled wine that was served by a non-Jew, because the worry, going back to the early Christian era, was that perhaps it had been used for idolatry, and once something was used for idolatry, it becomes forbidden to get benefit from it. So some things like sake is always kosher, for instance, unless it has some kind of strange flavoring or rye. In general, all of these things, a lot of these things are kosher if they're just plain ingredients. But the exception, as you've mentioned, is that if so on Passover, we get rid of our chametz in many different ways. We get rid of our leaven in several different ways, right? Not only you're not allowed to eat leaven on Passover, you're not allowed to own it, and you can't have leaven that you own. It says um, that leaven shouldn't be seen in your home, and it says there shouldn't be seen to you leaven, and so Talmud understands that to mean leaven that you own. So we do several things, right? We check our houses for chametz, for leaven that we don't know about, and we get rid of it. We nullify it. We make a declaration on the day before Passover at night when we search for the chametz, and during the daytime when we burn the chametz, that any chametz we own is ownerless. And in theory that should be enough, because if you made your chametz ownerless, I think I told that this last time, your leaven ownerless, if you gave up your ownership on it, then it's permitted to have it. You're not violating anything. But for two reasons, you have to do more than that. You have to either get rid of it or give it or sell it to a non-Jew. And the reason is because, number one, you might find it and eat it during Passover. Or number two, we're worried that your declaration that you're giving up ownership is not wholehearted because it's still there in your house. So what do we do? So it seems like a loophole, and it was. It started about 1,000 years ago when Jews were, there wasn't a lot of businesses Jews could be in because they couldn't own land in many parts of Europe. But there were Jews who were in the whiskey business. And when you're in the whiskey business, you have a lot of very expensive whiskey, or not expensive whiskey, but you have a lot of it and you're aging it. So if Passover comes and it's made out of grain, you're in big trouble. Because there's a rabbinic decree that any chametz, any leaven owned by a Jew over Passover is forbidden to consume even after Passover and forbidden to get benefit from after Passover. Which is why there are lists for shopping after Pesach. What stores can you go to? If there's this Jewish-owned store that didn't sell their leaven for Passover, you have to wait till their stock turns over. And often you wait about 30 days, and then we assume their stock turns over. There is a Jewish-owned liquor store in the neighborhood on 31st and M, so I sell their leaven. Now, it's a very interesting question. How can I sell their leaven to a non-Jew? They're doing business with it all of Passover. They're not religious people. So, but there is a response, a halachic response about that, but that we rely on. So the problem is that if a whiskey distillery was owned by a Jew and the Jew was not an observant Jew, they didn't sell it to a non-Jew over Passover. So all of that whiskey was owned by a Jew over Passover. You're not allowed to drink it or get benefit from it, so you can't buy it. So this became an issue. There were Jews in the whiskey business, but they weren't distillers in America, and I guess until more. Well, they probably were, 100 years ago, but but then more recently, as the world of whiskey became more expensive and just became a thing. So this came up. For instance, so how do you know? How do you know what's owned by a Jew, what's not owned by Jews? The answer is there are people who do research, and one of them is this organization. So if we go to American, now most Scotch doesn't have this problem. The only problem Scotch has is that some of it is aged in barrels that used to contain wine, in wine barrels. Some people permit that, some people do not. I allow people to use it in their house, but we don't we don't use it in the synagogue. So you have to know if Scotch generally is kosher, because as far as I know, there aren't Jews who own Scotch businesses in Scotland. But there are conglomerates of whiskey in America that were owned by Jews. So for instance, there's a bunch of Scotches here. Scotch generally, bourbon. Bourbon generally is kosher. But if it was owned by a Jew over Passover, that's a problem. So if you look here, it seems a little random if you don't know what you're looking at. But for instance, so here it says these kinds of bourbon, right? This one's called 1792. It's not recommended unless you purchased it before Passover 2009. Now, where is that from? The answer is that it was bought by a Jew, this company, in 2009. And therefore, and he didn't sell his chametz, or she didn't sell her chametz. And so, if you can get your hands on a bottle that wasn't owned by a Jew, uh, you're okay before 2009, but afterwards you're in trouble. Um, and it sounds like they still don't sell their chametz. Most of these bourbon companies are owned by conglomerates. That's why you have a bunch of different ones. But so I'm guessing the same people own Bauman as Ancient Age, 1992, 2003. Whenever it was bought by a Jew, that's when it became forbidden. Um, uh, there is a very famous there's a very expensive bourbon called Pappy Van Winkle. It can go for 20-30 grand, $20,000-$30,000 a bottle, and it was owned by Buffalo Trace, I think, and that was owned by a Jew, starting in like 1992, I think. Whatever conglomerate this is. And so if you want kosher pappy, you have to buy it. You probably have to spend 50,000 because you have to get it from before 1992. So now some of them started selling their chametz. So for instance, Buffalo Trace, which is owned by a Jewish company, they have a kosher brand. In other words, I don't know if they're selling all of their whiskey, but they're clearly selling some of it, because you can go into a liquor store and you can buy um, a bottle of Buffalo Trace, and it's got a big sign kosher on it. I mean, half the label says kosher. And they're doing that because they went out of their way to sell it. Lots of these are owned by non-Jews, so those are fine. But that's the story behind it. Now, I think you're asking the question of what does it mean owned? Does it have to be majority owned? Does it have to be controlled by? What if one Jew owns a share of stock in Brown-Forman? Is that a problem? I mean, that's an enormous whiskey conglomerate. So the answer is it has to be majority. It probably has to be majority owned by a Jew, or controlled by a Jew, or both. I think there's some argument about that, as you said, but I assume that's what they're going by. In other words, if something's a public company, I don't think we're worried about individuals who own small amounts of stock and can't really control the company. Yeah, see, Weller and Pappy, they're all owned by the same person. I read a book once about it, about bourbon, about I think it was about Pappy Van Winkle. Anyway, the that's the story. Does that answer it? So you'll find there will be, if you look, Kesher has a guide for Passover. If you don't have that, let me know. I can give a link. And but there's also local rabbinic organizations like the Vod of Greater Washington has a booklet, and in it they'll list, that there are certain stores that you don't want to shop in after Passover until you wait about 30 days, and that's because they're owned by Jews. Now, some people are worried also about not just stores that are owned by Jews, but distributors. There's some argument about this because we're talking about a rabbinic injunction that you're not allowed to get benefit from chametz owned by a Jew over Passover. And we have a general rule that when you're in doubt about a rabbinic law, that you are lenient. Now, so the question is, how far does this go? Okay, understand if the grocery store is owned by a Jew, so and I'm in there right after Passover, so the odds are very high that this food was in there on Passover. But do I have to worry that maybe a Jewish distributor brought it to the store? I mean, we don't know. Like, how long was it in? There's a lot of doubts about that. So some people are more lenient about that. So you will see certain differences between the Kesher list and the Vod of Washington list. There are probably other lists also from national kashrus organizations like the OU or the Star K or the OK or the Chaf K. There's many kashrut organizations. There also, you'll find online, and I can give you some links if you need them. There are kashrut organizations online that have lists of things that don't need supervision for Passover. So not everything needs supervision for Passover. Do raw nuts need supervision for Passover? So offhand, I don't know, but there are lists that you can look on for that. There are also actually the Vod of Phoenix has a list of tequila. There's like, I don't know, 100 tequilas that are kosher for Passover. Not because anybody's putting supervision on them, but just because they know that there's none, because the ingredients in these things are so regulated. And of course, because it's one of the few whiskeys not made out of grain. And sometimes you'll find Passover supervision on things like tinfoil or plates, or none of that needs it. They just put it on there, but it doesn't need it. So if you look around online, there is a website called kashrut.com, I think, and it has links to a lot of different kashrut organizations. Sometimes it's good central clearinghouse. Brady, I make my own kombucha. I have a SCOBY which ferments the black tea. Is the SCOBY good for Passover? What is SCOBY? Is it like starter?
I think Brady may have jumped off.
Oh, okay. So you have to know. So yeast itself is not necessarily a problem if there's no grain involved. There's only 5 grains that can become chametz, and become leaven. It's wheat, barley, oats, spelt, and rye. So on a biblical level, if you took corn and you made bread out of plain corn, you ground corn into flour and mixed it with water and let it sit and become bread, if it could, that would not be chametz, that would not be leaven. It's only wheat, barley, oats, spelt, and rye. It happens that they rise in certain specific ways. They have certain amylases and gluten and things like that. Brady, I'm just looking at your question. What is SCOBY, like a starter? So I was saying that the issue is if it has grain. In other words, if it has never been exposed to grain, and then it's not a problem. I mean, the yeast itself is not a problem. Shouldn't be. It's specifically those 5 grains. Now, interestingly, only those 5 grains can be made into matzah. If you make matzah out of corn or out of rice, that's not matzah. That you can't do the mitzvah. You can't fulfill the commandment of eating matzah at the seder with that. Matzah can only be something that you stopped it from rising by baking it, but it could have become chametz. And there's something deep about that, obviously, connected to the things we were talking about before. But that's why when you bake matzah, you have to, most of us don't bake matzah today. In more ancient times, everybody did bake matzah, their own matzah. But you have to, as long as you're working the dough, our tradition is it doesn't rise, but that if you leave it for 18 minutes, it will rise. And then it would not be usable as matzah. And there's a whole process of making matzah. You have to let the water rest overnight so that it's because if there's heat involved, it could become leaven faster. Obviously, matzah represents leaving Egypt in haste because it wasn't time for the bread to rise, but it actually also represents being in Egypt because it's the food that slaves were given. Because you don't give a slave bread, it takes more work to make bread. And so everything at the Seder really represents both freedom and slavery, bondage and Exodus. Because really the Seder is a kind of meal of transition. It's not really one or the other. Yeah. And we search for chametz also. We do it this year. So Wednesday night is going to be the Seder. So Tuesday night, after it gets dark, you take a candle and a feather, you search for leaven that you might not have found. And then if you come to my backyard on Wednesday morning after between 11:15 and noon, in my backyard we'll have a fire, and you can bring if you have some pieces of chametz that you found or that you have, There is an argument. It does say in the Torah not just not to have leaven, but to get rid of leaven, to destroy it. And so there's an argument, what if you don't have any leaven, if you don't have any bread? Do you have to get some in order to destroy it? Sounds a little absurd. And if so, how do you destroy it? So there's actually an argument about this in the Mishnah, whether you can destroy it just by, selling it or crushing it up and throwing it into the wind, or do you have to actually burn it? And there is an opinion that you have to actually burn it. You have to transform the chametz into something else, the leaven into something else. So, into nothing, essentially. And so we do all of that. I mean, we get rid of our leaven, but we also have some that we burn. And so because in Washington it's not so easy to make fires, but I have a backyard, so I live at 3026 O Street in Georgetown. So if you need directions, I can give you directions. There's like an alleyway you can come down on the block, and my backyard will be the one that has smoke coming out of it. So you can bring a bed, not too much chametz, but whatever you searched for. If you bring it all, we'll burn it here, and then after the burning, you say another declaration, giving up your ownership on chametz, even not just chametz that you didn't own, but any chametz, even that, not just chametz you didn't know about, but even chametz, whether you know about it, you don't know about it. The night before, you make a declaration of chametz that you don't know about. Because chametz you do know about, you could still eat until about 11 o'clock on Erev, on the day before Passover. But then once you pass the fourth hour of the day, it's about noon this year, on the day before Passover, on Wednesday, then you can't own chametz anymore. Anybody else? Any questions? Yeah, Ben.
Question is about a concept I've seen referred to, but clearly don't fully understand. And I'm not sure if these are synonyms, but the concept of being cut off or excommunicated. This is karate.
Yeah.
Mm,
So that's partly it's because we're not exactly sure what it is. So you're right that I think what you're getting at is that that if you eat something unkosher, the punishment biblically is lashes. But if you eat chametz on Pesach, eat leaven on Pesach, on Passover, the punishment is more extreme. It's karet. Now, this seems to be a kind of spiritual cutting off. So there's some argument among early commentators. Does it mean, sort of cutting off of your soul from its roots in the divine and you wouldn't have share in the world to come? Or does it mean getting sort of separated from the Jewish people on some spiritual level? It seems to be, it's not something that the court does. It's something that is something spiritual that's done, where it happens. But it seems to be a dividing off from the Jewish people. There's also, if a person lives at the time of the temple and does not bring the Passover offering, the punishment is also karet. Why? Because these things, I think the idea is that it's one of the other positive commandments that has karet for not doing it is circumcision. If a person is a Jew, is not circumcised, so they can always get circumcised, but in theory, if they decide not to, it carries that punishment. Why? Because these are like what you realize is that chametz on Passover, leaven on Passover, is not just like eating something not kosher. Eating something not kosher is not necessarily a denial of sort of your Jewish roots. In a certain sense, it's a natural punishment, karet, because eating leaven on Passover is a sort of, you've already separated yourself from the Jewish people, because Passover, and it's interesting. I think almost more than any other holiday, I think even Jews who have very little connection to Judaism often have a Seder. It doesn't mean it's fully Seder in tune with Jewish law, but why is the Seder so popular? I think the answer is that it is like it's about Jewish identity. It's not just about I keep this law. It is about law and it is about doing mitzvahs, but eating leaven on Passover is like it's much worse than eating something not kosher because It's and that's also part of why people are so attuned to cleaning their house, koshering their kitchen. You know, it's like it has like the ante's a little higher on with chametz, with Passover and chametz. I mean, it's fundamental to what it means to be a Jew, and because it represents, of course, the birth of the Jewish people. That's what separated us.
Is karet something you can come back from? Is
Yeah,
there?
yeah. You can always do teshuvah. You can always repent, of course. Yes, yes, for sure. The My wife grew up Reform, and she says that when she was little, they would eat on Passover. They would eat ham and cheese sandwiches on matzah. So now that sounds kind of crazy, but the truth is, it's not so crazy because that somebody would be more careful about not eating bread on Pesach than they would be about kashrut. Not just halachically, but sort of theologically, it's not so crazy. It sort of makes sense. But I mean, I'm not saying that's what a person should do, but that is. But I think many more Jews are in tune with Passover than they are perhaps anything else, and for good reason, because Passover is the root of Jewish identity, which you would think that Mount Sinai would be. Right? You would think receiving the Torah would be. It's very interesting. We have so many commandments in memory of the going out of Egypt. We say the Shema twice a day. And the Talmud says, why do you say the last paragraph of the Shema at night? The last paragraph of the Shema mostly talks about the mitzvah of tzitzit, putting strings on the corners of a four-corner garment. And that doesn't apply at night because it says you have to see them. And so the Talmud says, no, because it talks about the going out of Egypt in the last paragraph of the Shema, and you have to do that in the day and the night. Twice a day, you have to remember the going out of Egypt. You say the Kiddush, and in the Kiddush on Shabbat, Shabbat is in memory, both of the creation of the world, but also the going out of Egypt. For all these things that are in memory of the going out of Egypt. Like, we don't have any mitzvah, we don't have one commandment in memory of standing on Mount Sinai. We don't. Or entering the land of Israel. All these important things. But going out of Egypt, we're like constantly trying to remember, which is very interesting. There's something about that moment of transition from, I guess that's the birth of the Jewish people. That's when God sort of took us out. It's without that, there wouldn't be a Jewish people, as we say in the Seder. And if God had not taken us out, we and our children's children, we would all be slaves, and we'd still be slaves in Egypt. I don't know if we really would, but we wouldn't be the Jewish people. And so there's something about Egypt. It's funny, I was doing an interfaith podcast today about Passover. It was me and a minister and an imam, and the imam was from Africa. It happens that he wasn't from Egypt, but I was talking about Passover, and I was like, the Egyptians, they put us in bondage and this and that. And I thought, if there's Egyptians listening, they probably are taking offense at this. So obviously it's the ancient Egyptians, but Egypt becomes this sort of watchword in Jewish thought. Egypt is a representation of something. The Torah itself actually says two sort of separate things. It says you should be kind to the Egyptian because you were strangers in their land, which is wild because we were slaves in their land. They tried to kill us. And yet we lived there for 200 years. And at the beginning, it wasn't that bad. They did welcome Joseph and his brothers. And so the Torah itself actually says that you should be kind to the Egyptian. But it also says you shouldn't go back to Egypt. Now, people did go back to Egypt. Maimonides lived in Egypt. Egypt had, the oldest synagogue in the world is in Cairo from 822. It's where the Cairo Geniza was, where they found all these papers from over 1,000 years ago in the attic of the synagogue in Cairo. It's still there. And so Jews did live there, but actually today, if you try to, my kids are in Israel and they're trying to come home for Passover, and the only way to get out of Israel now for Passover is through Egypt. It's not the only way. You can also get out through Jordan, but is it more of a spiritual going back? I mean, for the Jewish community that was there? No. I think, Maimonides, for instance, was chased out of Spain by the Almohads.
I
And
mean, more like
yeah.
maybe it doesn't literally mean geographical Egypt, but more of going back into bondage in a spiritual or moral sense.
Right. Right. When you mean when the Torah says that, yeah. So I think you have to understand it in some way that way, yeah. Right. I think that is, yeah. I think that is how it's seen, or that there are certain reasons you could go to Egypt. Yeah. We'll look at the verse. I have to do a little bit of research and see. But yeah, there were ways to permit it for sure. Yeah. Abby.
Another Hametz question. How do people
Yeah.
handle pet food that often contains Hametz on Passover?
Oh boy, this is a biggie. Yeah, I've been getting questions recently. It's a problem because not only are you not allowed to eat chametz, you're not allowed to get benefit from it. Um, and um, and it's considered chametz. It's funny, the definition for what is still considered chametz in the Talmud is if a dog won't eat it. But if it's pet food, clearly a dog will eat it. So the so the best thing to do is to try and get your pet onto something else before Passover, onto some non-chametz pet food, and there are lists online of what pet foods are chametz, what aren't. Basically, if it doesn't have any grain listed in the ingredients for pet food, that's not enough for human food, but for pet food, that's usually okay. Like it could have legumes in it, it could have rice in it, that stuff's okay, because you can get benefit from that. Obviously, Sephardic Jews do eat legumes and rice, Ashkenazi Jews don't. But if you can't do that and you have no choice, the only choice would be to include your pet in the sale of chametz, and your pet in theory then would belong to a non-Jew somewhere. But the problem is you can't then just feed your pet chametz because you're still getting benefit from it if you're feeding an animal that's living with you chametz. So you really would have to find a non-Jewish person to feed your pet. And ideally, you would give your pet to them physically for a week, and they would hold on to your pet. And that's probably hard for people, but it's a problem. So yeah. The key is, I think, to think a few months in advance and to try and see, talk to a vet and see, can you get them on some other kind of food. That would be ideal.
Thank you. I don't have a pet right now. I was just curious how people handle that and just to know.
Yeah, yeah, pets can be complicated. There's probably whole. I bet you could read a lot online about pets in Jewish law because there's Shabbat and other things. There's issues. Yeah, very good. Now, of course, the first 2 days in the diaspora, the first 2 days of Passover are like a holiday. The last 2 days are like a holiday. The middle days, what will be this year, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, are like sort of like weekday, but not fully. There are certain things that we don't do on Chol HaMoed on the middle days because we're a little bit like a holiday. Like a person would not, should not. I mean, if a person can avoid working, that's best. But you are allowed to do milacha. You're allowed. It's not like Shabbat. Like you're allowed to drive. You're allowed to cook. You're allowed to do things for the holiday and to enjoy the holiday. If a person has to work, they can work. Um, but person try not to do too much like heavy labor or you shouldn't. It should be a semi-holiday, that sort of thing. The middle days, but of course, first two and last two are like Shabbat, except you're allowed to cook on Yom Tov if it's not Shabbat, and you are allowed to carry even if there's no Eruv. This year, there's a special thing that Shabbat, the first 2 days of the holiday are Thursday and Friday, Wednesday night, Thursday, Friday, and then Shabbat starts. So you're going to have to cook on the holiday, on the second day of the holiday for Shabbat. Now, it's a little different today. We have refrigerators, freezers, this, that. But that was the reality for people. So what do? You're not supposed to cook on a holiday for another day. You're not supposed to get ready on a holiday. It's a holiday. You're not supposed to get ready on it for another day. You're allowed to cook for that day, but I'm gonna. So we create something called an eruv tavshilin. You take two foods, one boiled, one baked. Usually it's like a matzah and an egg, from before the holiday, and you set them aside for Shabbat. So you've already started your preparation for Shabbat before the holiday, and that allows you to cook what you need to on the second day of the holiday for Shabbat. And that's something to remember to do for the first days. Second days, it's not an issue because the second days it's Wednesday, Thursday, and then you have Friday, and then it's Shabbat. So very good. Well, so we will not have class the next 2 weeks because obviously it's going to be Passover. After that should be okay. So I wish everybody a Chag Sameach, have a good holiday, and hope it's one that is takes a lot of work, but I hope it's also a fulfilling one. Chag Sameach.